Isn't communism too loaded a term? And shouldn't we continue to express our ideals in terms of the emancipatory energies of democracy? Is that, yeah, that's fair? Fair enough? Or how do we get from A to B? Well, I mean, I did end with the party and revolution. And so one of the things that I think is we can't get to an egalitarian future with democratic means in the societies that we have now. And so the means, I think, are political organization in terms of a revolutionary party. Okay, so the question is, aren't there important political questions like the burqa that the will of the party can't address? And so first, I don't have an idea of the will of the party. The party doesn't have a will. The party is an organizational form that recognizes that the people are an incomplete and always incomplete kind of subject. So I don't think the party doesn't have an independent will. The party is a form for acknowledging and mobilizing this incompleteness. Second, I don't think that the question of the burqa is a crucial question for communist revolution. I think it might be a crucial question for multicultural democracies, but that's not a foregrounded question. I don't have an answer for it. I think it would have to be, I think it's something that would have to be addressed, but only afterwards, right? After there's conditions of an egalitarian economic form, because until you have an egalitarian economic form, all of these other questions will only be addressed partially, will always be ruptured by the division between the 1% and the 99%. They will be configured by capitalism rather than actually being a discussion about the burqa. The first one was like a communist drive. And what was the second one? Hysterical communist desire. Yeah, those are good. I have to work on that. And I think the first thing I would say is that right now, for us, it doesn't make sense to talk about communist drive, right? The circuits that we're in are capitalist circuits of repetition. And the kind of convergence of capitalism and democracy, I call this communicative capitalism, that traps us in these circuits. I think that the sort of desire that I have in mind would be more like the desire of the analyst. And so that's why it actually is basically a form that doesn't have a lot of content in it at all, other than its own collectivity. I think it would be really cool to do an analysis of some of the states and cultures that came into being after World War II under the, in the Soviet orbit, and wonder and look at that, whether or not does it make sense to look at those in terms of something like a communist drive or something like a hysterical desire. I don't have an answer for that. I'm not sure. I mean, I think it would be a really cool project to look at that and see if it would work out. Yeah, it's a good question. Well, communism is in the future because we're at a point of intense capitalist crisis, right? So that we're not outside of a horizon demarcated by communism, right? That's a fact of the failure of capitalism. And so we can't avoid that failure of capitalism. Our choice now is, do we let it run us over? And so we basically get eaten by the 1%. Or do we resist it? And do we find a way to organize something else? One of the things that's just so maddening about contemporary culture is that we're told all the time, any individual can do anything. Well, that's obviously wrong. And yet we're not told that collectively we can shape things, right? That's the problem. That's what we've got to stop being, we've got to stop believing that. We've got to stop believing that individuals can do anything, because it's just not true. And we've got to stop forgetting that there's collective power. That was one of the great things about the Chicago teacher strike, right? Did it accomplish everything it wanted? No, no, no. But did it show that you could have mass opposition and collective action by a huge number of people? Yes, it did. That's one of the most exciting things about the last year and a half of movements, right? Is collective action by mass groups of people. So I think that we have to stop. This is, I hope that that my contribution with the Communist Horizon book and the other books, now this sounds like a plug, but the other books in the Verso Pocket Communism series, that the effort is to try to get people to stop being bewitched by the Cold War and thinking that that's the only possible vision of communism that we can have, right? And the other thing is what, communists are, people who are actively thinking about communism now are learning from the last 40 or 50 years of history, last 100 years of history, and by the new movements. So when you say, I don't want to be organized by a revolutionary party, that seems scary. The thing is that if we are all the revolutionary party, like everybody here, if y'all want to sign up, I've got a sheet. We can, if we're all doing it, then we can make it a different one, right? I think you lock into like there's only one possible revolutionary party and it leads to gulags, but you don't think that about anything else, right? Nothing else do we think so deterministically about. So if the party is us, then we make it what we want it to be. Right? So the question is, oh, come on, right? Isn't it really likely that more will be left behind than the 1%? We have legacies of racism, sexism, homophobia. It's important to not abandon or forget the 30, 40 years of anti-racist, feminist, queer work that has tried to open us up to the varieties of oppression. And that's in keeping with Marx and Lenin, who understand communism as a force on the side of the oppressed in every situation. And so I think that what has to happen is that as we renew an understanding and reinvigorate and re-understand communism for us now, we have to learn from that and work as hard as we can to always be attuned to that kind of exclusion so that it doesn't happen again. But I'll try to be even more self-critical about it, right? I mean, what about different kinds of religious minorities? I think that's a likely real issue to the extent that some religious minorities might want to hold on to the possibility of a 1% being rich. To my mind, that's an economic argument, though not a religious one. And so it's like, well, you're on the wrong side. I don't mean you, right? But I mean, no. Yeah. Okay, so the question's about, is my vision of communism very, I guess, US-centric? And I actually don't think so, right? I mean, communism names an international. It's always been international, right? It's the third, first, second, third, fourth international. It's not a West thing, but I speak from where I am and try to be mindful of that. The other thing to keep in mind is, in fact, that historically there have been multiple different kinds of communism all over the world. One of the pictures that I had on the slides was from Nepalese communists, or Nepalese Maoists, or communist Maoists. Yeah, anyway, from the Nepalese revolution. And so there are different revolutions that do different things. So I don't think that it's just.
How about, let's say, North Korea?
Yeah, I don't really see them as allies in this. I'm going to bracket that. I don't know what to say about North Korea, but I don't think of them as a communist country. I mean, they might call them that, but it's clearly an authoritarian regime. So, yeah, maybe the people would rise up. Pardon?
Communist Horizon, they wouldn't be part of that.
The thing is that I right now am not willing to appropriate things that I don't know about into my theoretical view. I think is a strength, not a weakness. And I think that it's an open question. Yeah. I don't think though that the way I'm approaching it is liberal, because I don't think it's a matter of any individual choice, right? I think that that's actually the difference between a liberal and a communist approach. It's not like a kind of lifestyle, well, now I'm going to be a communist and just I will individually choose it. Rather, it has to be something that is collectively produced via institutions, practices, movement that sweeps up folks. Now, we are in, I'd say US, Canada, Europe. I don't know if I would want to say everywhere in the world, because I think that would be a mistake. Probably not North Korea. We have been interpolated to be individuals and to think constantly about our individuality. I think it's important to further those theoretical and critical practices that call that into question for us, that let us recognize how things like our affects are actually transsubjective, how the things that we think are most individually ours are actually fantasies or products of social conditions, and that we can start actually recognizing the ideological hold of this fantasy of an individual subject on us. But I think that's a practice that also comes out a lot. I mean, it's a practice that works on people a lot in active movements, right? When you're actively working with groups for other things and you find that your own individuality shrinks back, and that's a liberating feeling. So do I need to have kind of more steps about that? Yes. But I don't think that the theorization I have is caught within a liberal approach to the individual. It's more a recognition that we have been produced as individuals, and that has to be addressed. Yeah. I mean, I notice a tension in your comment between a claim that equality is impossible and a claim that we are already equal. So I'm not sure, I'm actually not sure which you actually think, right? And see, I would want to say that, look, economic equality is possible, right? That is possible with a kind of approach to production that involves sharing, involves distribution on the basis of need. It involves sharing responsibilities, rotating responsibilities. Is it going to be is it easy to organize a mass of equal people without hierarchy? No, but having temporary hierarchies or hierarchies in one set of things does not have to mean that you have economic or permanent hierarchies, right? So you can imagine let's say we think of something like a mass movement that works in working groups. The working groups can rotate responsibilities within the people in the group. People can move back and forth into different working groups. So you can have an equality in that group and temporary hierarchies that do organizational things. I don't think that's actually that hard to imagine.
No, we can definitely imagine, but how long will it last before that equality devolves into inequality? Because
doesn't that depend on us? Right? It depends on us having the collective desire to continue being collective subjects. And that's something that we have to work on repeatedly. This is why, I'm sorry to interrupt, this is why two components of my account are there. One is that is the sovereignty of the people instead of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The reason is dictatorship is temporary, as if you were going to solve the problem. No. You're not going to solve the problem once and for all. We are human beings in a world with, that's facing climate problems, right? So we've got a lot of ongoing, not necessarily solvable in the next couple of centuries problems. Given that, we have to retain our desire to work collectively. Right? We have to instill that in our practices. We can't, if that goes away, if we stop desiring collectivity, then yes, we would have hierarchy, right? And another way to think about it, we are cultivated constantly as individuals. We are the intensity of reproducing us as individuals is ongoing. We could also imagine a version that says no, we will intensely work on making sure that people try to think, how do we make sure everyone's benefiting? How do we think collectively? And if you want something that's a little less scary, actually multiculturalism has been fairly successful as a way to get people to stop thinking in terms of racial superiority. Are there still racial superiority? Is it still in our institutions and practices? Yes. But has there been a lot of success in recognizing we need to not have racist institutions and practices? Also, yes. So I think that we don't need to say, oh, well, this is impossible, let's give up, right? I don't want to continue with just a supposition of I will individually try to act equally. I will persist within the ongoing institutions that we have. I will try to refrain these on these smaller levels. I actually think that we are doomed if we do that. But I recently read, there's a wonderful history of African American women in the Communist Party in the 20s and 30s in the United States. Yes, what's it called? Yes, Sojourning for Freedom. Lovely book, really wonderful in showing that not only was the Communist Party in the US one of the first strong anti-racist forces in society, but also that it was a training ground for a whole generation of militant women, right? It gave them extra experiences. So, and then there was another one on just African Americans in general in the history of communism that is also out in the last couple of years from Duke University Press. So I found those really useful. On YouTube, there's videos from a movie that was made in, I want to say, 1987, and I think it's called The Red Thread. And it's a history of communism in the US, and it starts in the 20s and 30s, and a lot of it's done with interviews from activists. Is that right? Yes, Yes. And it's a kind of wonderful, inspiring history where you see people talking about, not everyone remained in the party after Khrushchev's speech, not surprisingly, but some people stayed in it and then left at other points in time. Right after McCarthyism actually had a little bit less of an impact on the Americans than I think Khrushchev's speech did. I mean, you would know more about the history than I did, but recovering that I think is crucial to trying to make. Basically to any ideas of let's reinvigorate the discussion, and remembering the good history matters a lot. I gave a talk in Troy, New York in the winter about the left and Occupy Wall Street. And a number of folks in the audience were folks who'd been active in the Communist Party in the United States in the 30s, and they described helping integrating apartment complexes by just occupying apartments. When folks would come to evict African American people, they would just occupy it, and so that they couldn't. So the evictors who didn't want an integrated building would just have to leave. And so they were really strongly, they were really enthusiastic about the fact that they'd been occupying early, but also about the role of a Communist Party in building people's sense of trust and connection. Not trying to rescue Soviet-style communism. I think there were drawbacks, right? But okay, a couple of things. First, I don't think that we can address climate change if we begin the climate change discussion with the assumption that we let capitalism remain, or that we let actors who are corporations who make their money with extractive energy sources remain. And I don't think that with the states that we have, we can expect any kind of globally minded regulation of those of those companies. If that's the case, then it seems like the alternative is some kind of coordinated collective approach to dealing with energy problems, fossil fuels, and that kind of thing. So that's why I think that a communist solution is a better one than a capitalist one. On the primitive stuff, this is one of the places where I think some of my disagreement with some of the kind of contemporary anarchists is I see that as the real underpinning of a lot of contemporary anarchism is that the only answer is some kind of primitivism. And I think penicillin is important. I think that airplanes are important, and I don't think that we need to go backwards to go forwards. But I don't think our forward is determined. And I actually don't think that Marxism was as deterministic as Marxist critics make it out to be. And I think that that's really, it was never going to be one direction we know, right? I mean, that's just a kind of myth of determinism. But that wasn't Marxism. I mean, even in Marx itself, you've got at least two problems. You've got capitalism. Will capitalism collapse on its own, or does it need a revolutionary movement to bring it about? You've got agency and determination always interacting in Marxist theory. So that's just as a kind of bare level minimum. The determination that you speak of, I don't think it has legs. I do not think that a history happened once means that that is our only possible alternative, right? So the line of your thought leads to saying there is only one alternative, and that is if revolutionary party, then there must be some kind of dictatorship.
That's okay. But
That's-
I'm not saying, I will never say that we don't need an alternative. I'm just wondering if communism described in these terms is the alternative. That's what I'm asking.
I'm saying yes, and trying to convince people that the option's yes. Yeah.
It takes away the free will in practice.
It recognizes that free will is collective. Think,
Forced to be part of the collective makes you a piece of the bigger mechanism. And I'm not saying, I really enjoyed your theory. I'm not contradicting. I'm just desperate because I would like to see a solution, but I did live throughout a communist dictatorship. And I rather tend to agree with what she said, being equal in an unequal situation for myself was better than being, what did you say, being unequal in an equal society. Because we had, women were not equal, homosexuals were imprisoned until I think 2004 in Romania.
Romania is not my ideal, right? I mean, that's not.
It could be terrible.
So I'll put that. Note to self. Don't follow Romanian model. Okay.
Now, and don't get a crazy dictator like
Yeah, Ceausescu is not what we're looking.
That's not my problem. The problem is historic, and I might be wrong because I'm not a historian. But when a revolutionary, what's happening when a revolutionary party becomes a ruling party, and when it excludes the other party?
What it will be necessary for our revolutionary party to be willing to step down, to be willing to be self-critical, to be self-limiting. And I think that has to come from people's knowledge of what risks we don't want to take. And so is this a sure thing? No. What is a sure thing is that right now the kind of capitalism that we have is eating everything up, right? And we know, the stuff that we know for sure is that the austerity measures are basically collapsing the way of life for many, many people. It happened already in Africa. It happened in parts of South America. And we did nothing. And now it's come here and come to other parts of Europe, and do we still let that kind of privatization, that kind of essentially gross immiseration, do we let that continue? Do we continue to to basically say, well, we'll just be competitive, work all the time and try to survive and hold on? It's now in the middle, it's in the United States, a recent poll came in, over a third of the country now identifies as lower class or lower middle class. Right? Folks are recognizing that this idea of some kind of sustainable middle class, we don't have that anymore, and we can't under the kind of capitalism that we have.
How do you propose that the communist horizon beat a very steep tradition of individualism, and where it's successful, what happens to people that hold on to the tenets of individualism? Are they treated equally in this collective? Are they re-educated?
Re-educated,
crushed under the hammer that takes the capital away from the 1%.
Well, re-educated, but that sounds a little awful. But let's think about it, right? We're actually already used to forms of collective experience, right? We experience these lots of times in spectacular events, like stadia games or something. We experience it when we're out on the streets protesting. We sometimes experience it in the excitement of things flowing around online. We sometimes experience it when we feel kinds of similarities with friends that we're around. We sometimes experience it when we let go of our kind of Buddhism calls it like monkey mind or this grasping mind that makes us hold on to this fiction of our individuality. So I actually think that we would feel a little freer if we weren't so desperately trying to hold on and to make an individuality that is not, it's a kind of illusion, it's a kind of fiction. So I would want to say that it's not quite as bad as you suggest. And that in fact, if we're not constantly enjoined to be yourself, be yourself, be yourself, be yourself, then we might feel a little bit of relief. And this is the best answer. It's already violent now, right? I mean, the violence comes from the side of the state onto the people. So that part's already clear. I would also say that it doesn't make good tactical sense right now for small groups of people to take on state power. Right? I mean, that's just like, okay, so, and get slaughtered, right? That's not a good, that's just tactically really bad. The violence comes from, the first of the violence is in our society already. The violence comes from the state. So how do we work under those conditions? I don't know the best answer. We were talking this morning. I think that, hackers can play a role in bringing some systems down. But I think that I think it's naive. How do I want to put this? I don't espouse kind of nonviolence as a position. I'm not a peace at all cost, always nonviolent. I don't think that leads to. I don't think that is likely to lead to change under the kinds of systems that we have, let's say in the United States, UK, Canada, Western Europe. But I also think it would be wrong to plan for a violent revolution at this point. I think that would be suicidal. So I think it's a tactic that would have to unfold as things progress. Right? I think it's not a principle. For me, it's not a matter of principle. It's a matter of tactics. Marx was writing in a different time where there was not, there weren't participatory democracies, and so it was still a possibility that he thought, right? Where he thought that there could be democratic way. He actually, he thought that if workmen get the vote and organize as a labor party, then that was going to basically let a transition be possible, right? Or he at least entertained that. Other times it does seem like he thinks it has to be violent, but he entertains that. I think that the history of social democracy has shown that that's, you don't get to communism by social democracy, right? Instead, what we got was a form of accommodation with capitalism. So I think that the change in history is a reason not to think that you get there electorally, right, or through democratic means. Okay, so that to me is not a principled argument or anything. It's just a matter of like, look, that's not what happened. That's not what's happening now. It doesn't seem likely. I mean, the U.S. we only have two parties, right? We have a two-party system, so electoral options are not like really useful. Maybe in but even, I don't know, even in all of the European countries that had communist parties that did parliamentary, they just acted like awful parliamentary parties, right? They didn't, they conformed to the logic of the parliamentary system rather than became a vehicle for the rule of the people. So that's why I don't think, that's why I don't think that, oh, well, Marx liked democracy. That to me is not a compelling argument. I think there's been change. The other thing is the political theorists in the last 30 years love democracy, talking about democracy all the time. You don't need somebody else to talk about democracy, right? After my revolution, if folks decide, the best way that we can ensure the sovereignty of the people and form ourselves and ensure our collective desiring for collectivity, if we can best do that by working democratically, then that might be right. It might be that democratic forms produce collective desires, especially if we've gotten away from a heavy individualist ideology, and if we already have secured fundamental egalitarian economic distribution and production. Right? We no private property, so you already have a kind of basis, an economic basis for democracy. Then that's fine with me. I'm not so worried about that. Right? I think that there are lots of different ways to organize how people make decisions. And so I kind of think of that as sort of an extra, okay, well, how do we want this group to make decisions? How do we want that group to make decisions? And there are different models of that. So I don't think it makes sense to throw out those at that level, right, after the revolution. But But I don't think it's, it's not where I think that the energy should be. So.
The energy's here.
Oh,
Thank you
thanks.
very much.
All right, thanks.